The trial of Socrates in 399 BC remains one of the most extraordinary and unsettling legal proceedings in history. In Athens, a city celebrated for democracy and intellectual freedom, the decision to condemn one of its greatest philosophers revealed a profound tension between free thought and civic order. Socrates, 70 years old at the time, had spent much of his life questioning authority, exposing ignorance, and challenging traditional beliefs through relentless dialogue. His method of inquiry, which forced people to confront contradictions in their thinking, made him both respected and feared. To his supporters, he was a wise teacher devoted to truth. To his critics, he was a dangerous voice undermining traditional values and the fragile stability of the city. The charges brought against him were grave: corrupting the youth of Athens and committing impiety by failing to honor the state's gods while introducing new divinities. At a time when Athens was recovering from war, political unrest, and the betrayal of former students who had aligned with enemies of the city, Socrates' teachings seemed threatening to public order. Standing before a jury of 500 citizens, he refused to apologize or alter his beliefs. Instead, he boldly claimed that his role as a gadfly, someone who constantly challenges the complacency of the state, was a divine duty. His refusal to flatter the jury or show remorse likely sealed his fate. The jury voted to convict him by a narrow margin, and in the sentencing phase, Socrates remained defiant. Rather than proposing exile or silence, he ironically suggested he should be honored for his service to Athens. This provoked the jury further, and he was condemned to death by drinking hemlock. Accepting his fate calmly, Socrates transformed his trial into a symbol of intellectual integrity, moral conviction, and the cost of challenging authority. The trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633 stands as one of the most dramatic clashes between science and authority in history. Taking place in Rome, under the Roman Catholic Inquisition, it symbolized the tension between emerging scientific discoveries and the doctrines of the Church. Galileo, celebrated as the father of modern science, challenged centuries of established belief with his support for heliocentrism, the theory that the Earth revolved around the Sun. Galileo's troubles began when he publicly defended the Copernican model, which contradicted the geocentric teachings long upheld by the Church. His telescopic discoveries, including Jupiter's moons and the rugged surface of the moon, gave powerful evidence against traditional cosmology. Yet, these findings provoked opposition from conservative theologians who argued that they contradicted Scripture. Initially warned in 1616 to abandon such teachings, Galileo cautiously paused, but returned to the debate with his 1632 dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. This book, though framed as hypothetical, strongly favored Copernican theory and angered church authorities, including Pope Urban VIII. Summoned to Rome in 1633, Galileo faced charges of heresy. The trial was conducted by 10 cardinals of the Inquisition in an atmosphere already hostile to his cause. Despite Galileo's defense that he had not explicitly violated church orders, the court judged him guilty of suspicion of heresy. Under threat of torture, the aging scientist was forced to recant his beliefs. His book was banned, and he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 are remembered as one of the darkest and most infamous episodes in American colonial history. What started as a small circle of girls experiencing strange fits in Salem Village soon spiraled into a frenzy of suspicion, religious fear, and mass hysteria that claimed the lives of 20 people and imprisoned many others. At the heart of the crisis was a Puritan community already strained by political unrest, economic tensions, and ongoing threats from conflict with indigenous peoples and rival colonial powers. In this climate of unease, accusations of witchcraft offered a way to explain the unexplained while also settling old grievances. The first accusations targeted 3 women considered outsiders: Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin; Sarah Good, a destitute beggar; and Sarah Osborne, who defied social norms. Their trials emboldened further claims, and soon neighbors turned against one another in a widening spiral of denunciations. Courtrooms filled with dramatic testimonies, with accusers claiming to see spectral visions of the accused tormenting them. Judges admitted spectral evidence, such as dreams, visions, and invisible attacks, as legitimate proof, a decision that gave momentum to the hysteria. By the height of the trials, more than 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. 19 were hanged, with fear overwhelming reason, and the judicial system being distorted by paranoia, pressure from religious leaders. The tragedy eventually subsided when respected citizens began questioning the validity of the evidence. Within a year, the courts were dissolved, and most prisoners were released. The Dreyfus Affair was one of the most infamous trials in modern history, a case that exposed deep social divisions and tested the ideals of justice in France. The controversy began in 1894 when French intelligence recovered a torn document known as the Bordereau from the German embassy in Paris. It contained French military secrets, and suspicion quickly fell on Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a brilliant young Jewish officer in the French army. Anti-Semitic prejudice, already widespread in French society, made him an easy target. Despite his spotless record and lack of motive, handwriting comparisons and fabricated evidence were used to brand him a traitor. Dreyfus's 1894 court-martial was riddled with irregularities. Proceedings were held largely in secret, and the defense was denied access to a quote-unquote secret dossier that heavily influenced the judges. Prosecution witnesses painted him as arrogant and untrustworthy, while Major Henry delivered a dramatic but false accusation, pointing at Dreyfus as the traitor. Unsurprisingly, Dreyfus was convicted, stripped of his rank, in a humiliating public ceremony, and sentenced to life imprisonment on the remote Devil's Island. The case, however, refused to die. Growing doubts, new handwriting analyses, and the discovery of forgeries gradually revealed a conspiracy to protect the army's honor at the expense of truth. Public opinion fractured between the Dreyfords, who demanded justice, and the anti-Dreyfus faction, which clung to nationalism and prejudice. Ultimately, after years of appeals, exposes, and public outcry, Dreyfus was fortunately exonerated. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial became one of the most polarizing legal battles in American history, symbolizing the clash between justice and prejudice in the early 20th century. On April 15, 1920, a payroll clerk and security guard were killed during a robbery at the Slater and Morrill Shoe Factory in South Braintree. Two Italian immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were arrested weeks later while carrying weapons. Both were anarchists and outspoken critics of social inequality, which immediately marked them as suspicious during a time of widespread anti-immigrant sentiment. The United States was still reeling from the Red Scare, a period of intense fear of radicals, bombings, and labor unrest, making Sacco and Vanzetti easy targets. The trial in 1921 quickly became less about evidence and more about ideology. The prosecution emphasized their political beliefs, foreign background, and refusal to register for the military draft, while tangible links to the crime were weak. Eyewitness testimony was inconsistent, and no stolen money was ever found. Still, Judge Webster Thayer allowed prejudicial arguments, often mocking the defendants openly. Despite strong defense efforts and international campaigns for fairness, the jury convicted both men of robbery and killing. After years of appeals, protests, and global petitions, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed on August 23, 1927. Their deaths provoked outrage, with critics condemning the case as a miscarriage of justice fueled by xenophobia and political hysteria. The Scopes Monkey trial of 1925 became one of the most sensational courtroom battles in American history, yet again symbolizing the clash between science and religion in the public sphere. The controversy arose from Tennessee's Butler Act, which prohibited the teachings of human evolution in public schools. To challenge this law, the American Civil Liberties Union sought a volunteer defendant, and high school teacher John Scopes agreed to be tried for teaching evolution from the mandated biology textbook. At the time, the United States was in the midst of a cultural conflict between traditional religious values and modern scientific ideas, making the trial a lightning rod for public debate. The courtroom quickly became a stage for two larger-than-life figures. William Jennings Bryan, a three-time presidential candidate and devout Christian, led the prosecution, while famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow represented Scopes. Trial's proceedings were dramatic, with Judge John Ralston often favoring the prosecution. Thousands of spectators and journalists turned the small town into the epicenter of national discourse. The jury ultimately convicted Scopes and fined him $100, though the verdict was later overturned on a technicality. While Scopes faced little personal consequence, the trial showcased the tension between religious fundamentalism and scientific progress, leaving an impact on American education and law. The Nuremberg trials stand as one of the most significant legal events of the 20th century. Held in the aftermath of World War II, they symbolized a turning point where leaders were no longer immune to justice simply because of their position. Convened in Nuremberg, Germany, between November 1945 and October 1946, these proceedings captured the world's attention as an unprecedented attempt to hold individuals accountable for crimes committed on a global scale. The trials emerged directly from the devastation caused by Nazi Germany's aggression across Europe. With more than 27 million Soviet deaths and millions more killed in the Holocaust, the Allied powers sought a joint tribunal to establish responsibility. The London Charter of 1945 created the framework, outlining charges of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. While some allies had preferred executions or show trials, the United States pressed for a transparent legal process to demonstrate justice over vengeance. In the courtroom, 22 high-ranking Nazi leaders faced prosecution, with them being charged with orchestrating invasions, mass killings, and systematic persecution. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, 110,000 documents, graphic films of liberated camps, and survivor testimonies, exposing the magnitude of Nazi atrocities. Defendants largely denied knowledge or blamed subordinates, yet their arguments collapsed under the weight of proof. The verdict delivered in October 1946 sentenced 12 to death, 3 to life imprisonment, and several others to long terms, while a few were acquitted. The outcomes provoked debate, specifically over retroactive charges, but they marked the birth of modern international criminal law. The Rosenberg trial became one of the most controversial legal events in American history. Beginning on March 6, 1951, the case centered on Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, alongside Morton Sobel, who were accused of espionage for allegedly sharing atomic secrets from the Los Alamos project with the Soviet Union. The trial unfolded in a climate of fear, shaped by anti-communist feelings and suspicions of widespread infiltration. The government's star witness, David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, testified against them, while prosecutors leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. The Rosenbergs firmly denied all charges, refusing to admit to espionage or disclose their political affiliations. After only 2 weeks, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Judge Irving R. Kaufman sentenced Sobel to 30 years in prison and both Rosenbergs to death, declaring their actions had endangered millions of lives. Appeals for clemency were swiftly rejected by Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, despite massive protests and appeals from prominent figures including Albert Einstein. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing prison, sparking outrage and sorrow worldwide. In the decades that followed, declassified documents revealed Julius had engaged in espionage, but the evidence against Ethel was far weaker, with testimony later shown to be fabricated. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 became one of the most defining legal and historical moments of the 20th century. Held in Jerusalem, it captured global attention not only because of the crimes at stake, but also because it forced the world to confront the full horror of the Holocaust. For the first time, survivors testified publicly on such a stage, turning the courtroom into a space of both justice and memory. Eichmann, a senior SS officer, had overseen the deportation of millions of Jews to ghettos and extermination camps. After the war, he escaped Europe and lived in Argentina under a false identity until captured by Israeli agents in 1960. His abduction sparked international controversy, but Israel pressed forward, determined to try him under its 1950 law on Nazis and Nazi collaborators. The trial opened on April 11, 1961, with Attorney General Gideon Hausner declaring that 6 million accusers stood symbolically in the courtroom. Eichmann faced 15 counts, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. Sitting inside a glass booth, he claimed he was merely following orders, a quote-unquote cog in the machine. The prosecution countered with extensive documents, survivor testimony, and Eichmann's own admissions, proving his direct role in organizing mass deportations. The proceedings were televised, allowing the world to hear firsthand the voice of Holocaust survivors. On December 15, 1961, Eichmann was sentenced to death. His appeal failed, and in June 1962, he was executed, the only civil execution ever carried out in Israel. The treason trial of Nelson Mandela and his colleagues was one of the longest and most significant political trials in South African history. The trial emerged after the adoption of the Freedom Charter in 1955, a document that called for democracy and racial equality. In December 1956, South African police launched nationwide raids, arresting 156 activists from across racial lines, including Mandela and other leaders of the African National Congress. They were accused of plotting to overthrow the state and establish a communist system, charges meant to brand the liberation movement as a subversive threat. The arrest and the severity of the treason charge reflected the government's desperation to crush dissent. The proceedings were lengthy and complex. Defendants endured years of hearings, often appearing behind fences and under heavy security. The defense argued that the Freedom Charter advocated peaceful change, not violence. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered in solidarity, sometimes clashing with police. Despite the prosecution's massive effort, the state failed to prove its case. In March 1961, after years of testimony and thousands of pages of evidence, all remaining defendants, including Mandela, were acquitted. The trial solidified the unity of the multiracial Congress alliance, drew international sympathy, and prepared Mandela and his comrades for the next stage of resistance, culminating in the Rivonia trial only a few years later. The Charles Manson family trial of 1970 remains one of the most infamous legal battles in American history. Charles Manson, a career criminal turned cult leader, gathered a following of disillusioned young people known as the Manson family. In August 1969, several members committed the Tate LaBianca killings, resulting in the deaths of 7 people. Manson preached apocalyptic visions of a coming race war, which he called helter-skelter, claiming his followers' violence would ignite it. Prosecutors argued that Manson never directly killed anyone, but manipulated his followers into carrying out the crimes. The defense, fragmented and often chaotic, tried to depict Manson as misunderstood and his followers as acting independently. The trial was filled with bizarre courtroom behavior. Manson carved an X into his forehead, followers camped outside chanting, and witnesses described chilling devotion to him. In January 1971, Manson and several followers were convicted of first-degree killing and conspiracy. Originally sentenced to death, their penalties were commuted to life imprisonment after California briefly abolished the death penalty. The O.J. Simpson trial, often called the trial of the century, remains one of the most publicized court cases in American history. The events began on June 12, 1994, when Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend, Ron Goldman, were found stabbed to death outside Brown's condominium. Former NFL star and actor O.J. Simpson quickly became the prime suspect. After failing to surrender to police, Simpson was pursued in a televised low-speed chase, watched by nearly 95 million people. The trial formally opened with Simpson facing 2 counts of first-degree killing. Prosecutors relied heavily on DNA and forensic evidence, arguing that blood samples and fibers tied Simpson directly to the crime. However, his defense, famously known as the Dream Team, countered with claims of police misconduct, evidence tampering, and racial bias within the Los Angeles Police Department. Iconic moments, such as Simpson struggling to put on the bloody gloves, fueled reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. On October 3, 1995, Simpson was acquitted of all charges, sparking nationwide debate. The trial of Slobodan Milošević was one of the most important and closely watched proceedings in international law. Milošević, the former president of Serbia and later Yugoslavia, was indicted in 1999 during the Kosovo conflict. The charges were later expanded to include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed in Bosnia and Croatia throughout the 1990s. In total, he faced 66 counts, ranging from mass killings and forced deportations to persecution on political, racial, and religious grounds. The indictments reflected the immense human cost of the Yugoslav wars, including atrocities against Bosnian Muslims, Croats, and Kosovo Albanians. The trial began on February 12, 2002. Milošević chose to defend himself, delivering lengthy speeches in which he accused NATO and Western powers of conspiring against Serbia. Over 4 years, the prosecution presented more than 300 witnesses and thousands of exhibits, detailing massacres, ethnic cleansing campaigns, and the destruction of cultural sites. Milošević remained defiant, framing himself as a victim of political persecution. On March 11, 2006, before a verdict could be reached, Milošević was found dead in his cell from a heart attack. His death ended the proceedings without resolution, leaving victims without formal judicial closure. The trial of Amanda Knox gripped the world with its mix of tragedy, controversy, and cultural tension. In November 2007, Knox, a 20-year-old American exchange student, reported her roommate's death. Within days, she and her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito, were arrested. Prosecutors crafted a disturbing narrative of sexual violence and occult ritual, presenting Knox as manipulative and morally corrupt. The media eagerly embraced this portrayal, branding her Foxy Knoxy, which sensationalized the story and tainted public opinion before evidence could be fully considered. The trial began in 2009 and focused on disputed forensic samples, questionable witness testimony, and Knox's character. The defense countered that Rudy Guede, a burglar whose DNA and fingerprints were found in Kircher's room, had acted alone. Nevertheless, Knox and Solicito were convicted in 2009 and sentenced to long prison terms. Appeals followed, revealing major investigative flaws, mishandled DNA evidence, and coercive interrogations. In 2011, they were acquitted, only for the case to be retried, and the convictions reinstated in 2014. Finally, in 2015, Italy's Supreme Court definitively exonerated them, stating the case was marred by errors and insufficient proof. After the acquittal, Knox's life was permanently altered. She remained convicted of slander for wrongly implicating her employer during initial interrogations, a conviction upheld in 2023. The trial of Casey Anthony remains one of the most infamous legal dramas in modern American history. It's centered on the 2008 disappearance and death of 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony, whose remains were discovered near her family's home in Florida months after she was reported missing. Suspicion quickly fell on Kaylee's mother, Casey, after investigators uncovered troubling evidence. Her car trunk carried traces of human decomposition and chloroform, and her computer revealed searches for chloroform and neck breaking. Adding to suspicion were Casey's repeated lies to police, including fabrications about a babysitter and a job at Universal Studios. By October 2008, she was indicted on first-degree killing charges, a case that would carry the possibility of the death penalty. The trial opened in May 2011, lasting 6 weeks under the scrutiny of a media storm. The prosecution argued that Casey deliberately killed her daughter, citing her behavior and the forensic findings. The defense countered with a dramatic claim that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool, and that Casey's father, George, helped cover up the incident. Allegations of family abuse and contradictions in testimony deepened the spectacle. On July 5, 2011, the jury delivered a stunning verdict: not guilty on charges of killing, manslaughter, and child abuse. She was convicted only of lying to police. The outcome triggered outrage across the country, with many convinced justice had been denied. Casey was released soon after, facing both public scorn and personal isolation. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like, comment down below your thoughts on any of the court cases I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 2 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.